hit record. And as people come in, I will make sure that they get to be a part of our conversation today, which I'm very excited about. So hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Prashasti. You've received multiple emails from me at this point, and I'm really thrilled to welcome our fantastic group of panelists today who have all been spotlighted for your convenience, and they will lead us into the very important discussion about immigration and movement lawyering as part of the Immigration and Scholar Series. And Immigration and is a new justice-oriented program that is open to everyone. And I will drop a link in the chat again. And today's space is a space of reflection and hopefully some imagination. So we will start with welcoming our panelists and then be in conversation with them for about 50 minutes. I know it's jam-packed. We will end with some resources that I'll also send in a follow-up email. And I will be very much the chat box for today's discussion. So if you have any comments, if you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to put them down in the chat box. And with that, I will hand it over to the wonderful Hamsa, who is a staff editor on the Georgetown Immigration Law Journal, but will also be the incoming managing editor for volume 37. And most importantly, will be our moderator for today's discussion. So Hamsa, take it away.
Thank you so much, Prashasti, for that introduction. And I'm really excited to be moderating this panel today. We have a lot of really decorated scholars and professionals on this panel. So really excited to get this going. I wanted to first ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and ask them to keep it to a minute perhaps, and we'll try to drop the links to the panelists' bios as well so that people can get more of a background. Can we first start with Chioma Azi?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chioma Azi, and I am National Legal Director at African Communities Together, which is a community-based, membership-based as well, nonprofit organization that seeks to empower African immigrants to assert their rights at the national level, while also providing direct services. We have offices in New York, which is our headquarters, and also an office in the Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia area. I've been practicing law for, this is going into my 14th year, I think now. Previous to my time with African Communities Together, I was with another community-based organization called the African Cultural Alliance of North America, or ACANA for short, based in Philadelphia, where we also worked with the African and Caribbean immigrant community, helping these folks get adapted into their new environment. Trying to keep to a minute. So that's basically it. Been very steeped in immigration law, specifically family-based matters, removal defense, asylum, naturalization, work permits, and very happy to be here today.
And thank you so much for that. If we could move on now to Laila Hlass.
Hi. So glad to be in this space. Thanks for organizing. I'm a law professor at Tulane in New Orleans. I teach immigration law. I'm co-director of our immigrant rights clinic. And I've long been an practicing immigration lawyer for the past 15 years, mostly working with folks who are fighting deportation. I've worked a lot with young people. I'm also the child of an immigrant. My dad was a stateless Palestinian here in the US for a period of time before he became a citizen. And that's what's drawn me to this work and what informs my perspective too.
Thank you. And if we could move on now to Silky Shah.
Hi, everyone. So wonderful to be here with all of you. So I'm Silky Shaw. I'm the executive director of Detention Watch Network, and we're a national coalition that has been around since 1997. It's our 25th anniversary this year. fighting around immigration detention issues. And in 2012, we took a position to abolish immigration detention. So that's a lot of what we're working towards right now. I am also on the board of Just Futures Law. I have my mug here, which is a organization that's really thinking about movement lawyering and sort of innovative approaches to this and centering grassroots campaigns around these issues. In terms of my quick background, I'm not a lawyer myself. I have been working as an organizer since the post 9/11 era for a really long time on detention issues, on prison issues. I'm from Texas, where we saw a really large expansion of immigration detention in the Bush years. And so that's really where my base of work started on this issue. And yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. And last but not least, if we can get an intro from Azadeh Shahshahani.
Thank you so much, everyone. My name is Azadeh Shahshahani, Legal and Advocacy Director at Project South. I'm also a past president of the National Lawyers Guild. Both Project South and the National Lawyers Guild are abolitionist organizations. And in the case of the National Lawyers Guild, it was a process, a membership-wide vote that we agreed as an organization we're going to adopt an abolitionist stance. And Project South is a social justice organization based in Atlanta, and we work with grassroots organizations and communities in the US South, and we're also in solidarity and joint struggle with Black and Indigenous communities in the Global South.
Thank you so much for that, and also for everyone for introducing themselves. As you can see, we have a really diverse panel here and having a lot of different experiences within the movement lawyering. So this is a good transition to sort of start the discussion today by defining movement lawyering. And as you can see from the panelists, I think that there's a lot of different takes on what movement lawyering is. So we would love for the panelists to kind of share the basics of what that means to them and what it entails. There's a lot of terms that are floating around, like movement lawyering, radical lawyering, community-based lawyering. So we wanted to find some of the characteristics of the non-traditional models of lawyering, and what the particular personal vision of movement lawyering is to each of the panelists, and how do they achieve this vision through their work. And I would maybe perhaps we could start off with Chioma on this.
Thank you. It's a great question to start off with. I would say that I come very much from the tradition of, I guess, what we call community-based lawyering. The organization that I first started out with early in my career, ACANA, it was such an interesting journey to that organization because I was the first attorney there. They were basically made up of accredited representatives. So for folks who are not aware, there are people who are not licensed attorneys, but they can still provide immigration legal services if they are accredited by Department of Homeland Security. So in this instance, these are folks who were providing services to the community already, but were limited due to the fact that they didn't have any attorneys who could help. So these are people who are really at the grassroots, who are closest to the community, to people who have needs, who are working not based off of making a profit or ensuring the growth necessarily of a company expansion. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but really the goal, it's mission-based, right? You're working based on a particular mission for a particular group of people or community. So I think movement lawyering at its foundation is you're lawyering for a particular mission that's not attached to profits or growing profits for a firm. Again, not bashing or criticizing that at all, but it's tied to a specific mission or goal for a group of people, a community, or just an idea or concept. And so in my case, movement lawyering in my career has really meant how do we put the Black immigrant, African and Caribbean immigrants at the table of the discussion of immigration rights and policy in this country, because we are not the face, we are not considered, we are often left behind. So in my case, the movement has really been, how do we raise the voice of Black immigrants at the table of policy discussion?
Thank you so much for that. And perhaps we can move on to Azadeh on her perspective on this.
Thanks so much. So I guess my definition of movement lawyering is lawyering that is not directing the movement, rather taking direction from serving and being accountable to the movement. And so when I joined Project South in 2016, I was the first lawyer on a staff. The organization was founded in 1986 in Alabama, very much devoted to organizing and community education. And so as the first lawyer on a staff, it was very clear to me that I was accountable to the organizing and to the movement. My job was to create a program that is going to support the movement work. And so also looking at our guiding principles, so Project South is rooted in the Black radical traditions of the US South. And some of the guiding principles are directly impacted folks lead the struggle. We're in this for the long haul. So organizing and building social justice movements is really the only way that we're going to achieve victories. We have the traditions to look up to, so legacy of success because of organizing and grassroots movements, and people relying on internal resources as opposed to external factors, and the realization that nobody's gonna come save you. And so those principles have helped us kind of define how we're doing our lawyering work. So really relying on a variety of strategies, realizing that litigation is definitely not the only tool. And when it is brought, it is to support a movement, and to meet a demand that the movement has defined, such as shutting down ICE prisons. So for example, we have class action lawsuits pending against the prison corporations that run the Stewart Detention Center and the Irving County Detention Center in Georgia, based on the issues of forced labor and also the medical abuse against women's bodies at Irving. But again, it's always clear that this is a strategy in the broader set of strategies that is aimed at abolition. And also using creative strategies and thinking outside of the box. So as an example, we use people's tribunals as a tool to support the movement. And people's tribunals, for folks who aren't familiar, are basically, they're used when a community has been denied the right to voice their grievances and the human rights violations that they have suffered at a formal judicial forum. And so the first one that we know of was the Russell Tribunal, held to air out the crimes of the US government in Vietnam. And since then, thousands have been held in different parts of the US and different parts of the world. And so, for example, we had one focused on the Muslim ban in Atlanta after the Supreme Court delayed hearing the second version of the Muslim ban. So I'll share a resource on people's tribunals in the chat, and if anybody is interested in organizing one, feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you so much, Azadeh. Could we move on to Silky for her perspective?
Yes, I'm the non-lawyer on this panel, so I will offer some thoughts, but very, very open. I'm very curious what folks on the panel think, and also the folks who are attending. So, movement lawyering, from my perspective, you can't have movement lawyering without movement. Like it's a very central piece to this. And I think one thing that happens a lot in sort of the broader discourse, especially the liberal discourse, is a focus on the courts and on laws and the impacts that they have, and just like centering the courts. And we see that constantly with the Supreme Court, like this, whatever is going to happen in the Supreme Court is going to dictate everything. And that's actually really concerning, because actually in so many ways, what we've seen over the course of the existence of the Supreme Court and of this country is that actually a lot of other things are at play, and movements have played a significant role in shifting what happens. And I wanted to give, I think movement lawyers inherently need to understand that policies and politics are a really big part of what happens, and not just the law or just decisions in the court. And so one example I'm going to give is the unauthorized, unlawful reentry law 1326 that's on the books. That's a law that's been on the books, I think some of y'all probably know, since 1929. It was something that was prosecuted to some degree, not to the degree that we've seen, especially in the last 20 years, but it was on the books, but it wasn't a priority for many, many years. And then after there was a sort of concerted effort to inject a ton of money into border patrol, border militarization, and like programs like Operation Streamline, which had mass prosecutions, you started to see the number of people prosecuted for this law, 1326, unlawful reentry, go up. And it went from, some few thousand people in the 90s to I think 90,000 or so one year. It's since gone down recently because of Title 42. We'll sort of see what happens after Title 42 is lifted next month. But I think the key thing here to know is that there's a law on the books that isn't being addressed. And all of y'all know this, there's laws on the books that aren't things that we, necessarily see impacting people's daily lives all the time. But it was really the politics and the money that went in that actually got us to this point where we had this many people being prosecuted. So last year, we actually saw a Nevada judge rule that the law was unconstitutional, specifically because it was racist. And this was because of really great work from lawyers and also academics to show sort of the history and the impacts of it being a racist law. But it also didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened after one of the most popular uprisings we've seen in this nation's history for Black lives, the George Floyd uprising, the work that happened all in the summer of 2020. That's really changing the discourse and the conversations on this. So you could say, oh, look at this great. And it's so critical that lawyers play this role to sort of expose what's happening, but it's also happening because movement is saying, hey, this is not okay. These things are racist. And so I think this is just one example of where we have to understand it's the policies, it's the politics, it's the money that's being injected into these harsh enforcement programs, the militarization of the border, et cetera. And it's not just about getting that perfect decision in the court, or that's going to dictate what happens. And I could go on about that, but I just wanted to offer that as something in terms of how we think about movement lawyering.
Thank you for your perspective, Silky. And could we move on to Laila for her perspective on this as well?
Yeah, and just really appreciate learning from everyone in this space as well. I think I think we have a really great working definition of like what it is to be a movement lawyer. I mean, I would just say at the beginning of the question, you talked about like all these alternative forms of lawyering, community-based lawyering, radical lawyering. And I, certainly in like legal academic spaces, people throw around like 12 more of these terms. And I think I'm just going to kind of uplift some of the really important things folks have said and like add my own thoughts. But I think like it's about seeking justice alongside and directed by impacted communities, right? And so it's not about like reifying the law. Sometimes you may be using legal tools, but sometimes you're not, and so like the ultimate victories aren't just, as we're said, like we're winning this case, but it's like, how can we transform the reality, and how can we kind of change things on the ground. And an essential part, I think, is also just like being aware of power and privilege in relationships and systems. So that might be like interpersonal relationships between like lawyers and clients, and like lawyers and colleagues, you know, from the like lawyer point of view. But it's also just being aware of the larger like systems at play, and how that's when you kind of analyze the problem, like being aware of that, being aware, particularly, you know, as a lawyer, of like the privilege of that, and being careful not to kind of replicate and reinforce unjust systems, but to challenge them, even when that system is the legal system in which you're acting in. You know, and I think, as other people said, that it can take a lot of different forms. Like lawyering can mean a lot of different things in this context. So sure, it could be being in a courtroom, and like representing someone, or some kind of impact litigation, like representing like a class of folks, or trying to make a point. You know, you're going to lose the case, but like, you know, shedding light and delegitimizing something. It could be engaging, it could be providing technical assistance to the movement, or to organizers or communities in something that they're doing. It could be some kind of education event. So it could look like a lot of different things, but I think the key is like you're kind of helping build community power. You're knowing, you're cognizant of like your role as a lawyer and like what you can offer. And you kind of know that like the end game is not just like this more perfect legal system that already is in existence, but really fundamentally like, you know, a transformation to make sure that communities can, you know, self-determine, that they have, that they can fight against kind of the violence that's often being impacted amongst them. So thank you.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to thank all the panelists for helping us sort of create this definition of movement lawyering to just start our conversation. And I particularly am going to use Laila's comment on sort of the power and privileges to kind of segue into this next question on the ethics in movement lawyering, and sort of trying to define the features of movement lawyering that attempts to shift and redistribute power back to the people, sort of commenting a little bit about this like obvious power dynamic that exists between lawyers and the communities, and especially when law is often used as a tool for exclusion and oppression. So how do we balance these kinds of power dynamics, and how do we define the scope of the movement and who is involved in the decision? And I invite any of the panelists to answer, but I think it would be good to get a few of the panelists so that we could move on to the other questions. So not everyone, don't feel, I guess, that you have to answer, each of you has to answer this particular question. Feel free to jump in, sorry.
Yeah, I think just, you know, following up on everything that was said, it's really important to center the voices of those who are directly impacted, you know, as lawyers and law students, and, you know, people with a certain level of, you know, privilege in this system. We're often in situations where, you know, you're invited to a table or like a decision-making space where you're kind of invited to make decisions on behalf of other people who are directly impacted. And so, you know, one example that I was a part of, so the city of Atlanta was basically, you know, in a position that as a self-described, you know, progressive, welcoming city was making profit off of detention of immigrants through an arrangement they had with ICE. So in the summer of 2018, the mayor, you know, basically convened a task force to advise her on the next steps in terms of what to do with this arrangement. And so I was invited to be on this task force, was really one of the couple of, human rights organizers or, lawyers, etc. on this panel. It was kind of stacked with, a lot of other folks with different mindset, kind of reformist. And most importantly, there was no directly impacted person on this task force. And on top of everything else, ICE was sitting on this task force. So the first thing was, okay, let's make sure to keep ICE out. So they were gone. They stayed for half of the meeting, but then they left, thankfully. And much to my surprise, I was the only one in the room who seemed to have a problem with ICE sitting on a task force trying to advise the city on the next steps with the city jail. But then in terms of ensuring that the voices of directly impacted folks are heard, we basically, through our partners at Georgia Detention Watch, the coalition that we are all involved with, we reached out to the survivors of the Atlanta City Detention Center and their family members. So for the phone meetings, people called in from different parts of, the world, or family members called in. And so, like the reformist people on the task force basically couldn't get a word in edgewise because the directly impacted people were talking about their own experiences, which is, extremely powerful. And then for the third meeting, which was a meeting that was open to the public, again, partners arranged for directly impacted people to call in and family members to actually show up and basically urge the city to go ahead and shut this place down rather than you're keeping it open. And so, that's one example. Also documentation, human rights documentation is really important. So as part of this same city, task force, the head of the jail was also part of the task force, a person who had a direct conflict of interest because closing this, ending this arrangement would basically mean that he would, lose his job. And so he was putting forward all sorts of lies. And so, we were in a position where, we had done the human rights documentation with like voices and stories and accounts from directly impacted people. So we were able to counter all of those lies. And so, as a result of this campaign, the city, was moved to go ahead and at least, end the arrangement with ICE, and we're in the process of to go ahead and shut down the city jail altogether. So, this is just one example. There's been like many, countless examples of situations in which I've been invited to, and I'm sure you all as future lawyers will be invited to. And so the trick is always to ensure that you're not making decisions on behalf of other people where you yourself or your community is not kind of like directly impacted by, by the human rights violation that's being inflicted upon people.
I'll chime in here as a perspective of somebody who has worked with lawyers for a very long time and is a non-lawyer, and people assume I'm a lawyer just because I know things. I think there's like this thing that it's the immigrant rights movement's a hard place, in part because how many lawyers there are, because there's this sort of energy of this immigration law is so complicated. So there's this way that lawyers can sort of position themselves as, well, I know this better than you do. So actually, like, you're, this like idea you have, this is too extreme, or this is this and that, or I have a client who says they want something different. So I think to that point, like, one, I mean, I think there's just, it's so much about like treating people with dignity and respect. And I think that's like, unfortunately, it doesn't happen the way it needs to. And I think when you're a movement lawyer, that needs to be number one, treating not just the people you're working on behalf of, but also the people that you're working in coalition with, and, and organizers who, I think there are healthy disagreements. We should have those disagreements. We should have open dialogue about that, but it's also just understanding like, what are our shared beliefs and our goals, and where are we trying to go? And we can kind of like negotiate those things together. I think an example on this, Azadeh talking about the issue in Atlanta made me think of this in New York, when there was an effort to close the Hudson County or end the contract with the Hudson County Jail. a lot of the lawyers who came out against it actually were just like, well, my clients want to keep this detention center open. And so one, we weren't hearing from their clients specifically, but two, they were sort of positioning themselves as gatekeepers around like what their clients believed. And also they weren't doing that work and having those conversations with their clients. They weren't doing the work to say, actually, what are our shared beliefs? So it might be, and this, you know, this happens in the movement all the time, and why we've had messaging like immigrants aren't criminals is like people are just like, well, this is what I'm feeling, but it's actually so much about political education, so much about us understanding these systems and the problems with the system overall, and not just like thinking about things in like a specific moment or a specific instance, and understanding the impact of those decisions and the long-term decisions. So I think on detention center closure, a lot of people be like, well, people are going to be transferred, or a detention center might open up somewhere else, but they miss the point about the power building, and they miss the point about, you know, like these systems are really harmful. We're probably going to have some like bringing them down is not going to be the most perfect process. And I think lawyers really struggle with that. So I guess I would just say like so much of this is about seeing people as equals, understanding that, yes, we all have different things to bring to the table. Like the perspective on like the laws and what can happen within them is one piece of it, but also like what we can do with movement is a really critical piece.
Thank you for that. Oh, I'm sorry, Laila, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna just like add something short, because something that Silky said like also made me think, you know, I think that's 100% right. And you know, the interesting thing too is like when we think about roles is that like lawyers often do have a role to play in terms of like providing some like advice about what legal options are, but sometimes communities may have even better ideas too in that realm, and so I think it's just like being really conscious of that. Like I think back when I was a lawyer at Loyola's Law Clinic, and we were representing just like individual folks on to get trafficking visas who were part of the Signal litigation. You know, this was a case where this company with an immigration lawyer recruited and tricked and kind of got hundreds of workers to come from abroad and brought them into deep debt and kept them in kind of horrible conditions in these trailer parks and trafficked them. But like in initial conversations from some of the lawyers that like I heard from who were doing the work with the community, you know, they said like, initially we were thinking about this as like a workplace justice issue. Like there were stolen wages, there were all of these things. And the community members were like, no, that's not what happened. They trafficked us. And it was like the community insistence about like what the problem was that transformed the legal strategy. You know, I was just doing some of the, you know, the visa work, you know, we were doing that kind of part. And so I think also too, just like being aware that that it really is a partnership, and that like we aren't necessarily even experts in the legal system, like because the idea is to change the legal system. And so I think that's also kind of important to think about when thinking about those roles.
Thank you. So I wanted to maybe transition and ask a little bit one-on-one questions on like the role of lawyers, but I know that not that, you know, Silky's not a lawyer, but very well knowledgeable about the subject. And we'd love to know more about what's been successful in Detention Watch Network, since it's, you know, you've led a bunch of several impactful campaigns and such, and what are those sort of specific strategies in leading these campaigns, and what are the goals? So I wanted to sort of invite you to talk a little bit about your role in this, and also the involvement of like lawyers in this particular work.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful to be here with y'all after winning like 2 really major campaigns in the last few weeks. We, you know, our like big strategies are, one, shut down detention centers. We have a campaign, sort of umbrella campaign that Azadeh and other folks have been involved in called Communities Not Cages. That's really trying to close existing ICE detention centers and stop any further expansion. And then we also have a campaign called Defund Hate that's really looking at defunding ICE and CBP. In the last few weeks, we, over the last year, we launched a campaign called First 10 in relationship to Communities Not Cages that called for closure of 10 detention centers in Biden's first year. And we've actually won on a couple of them, one which Azadeh worked on a lot, Irwin in Georgia, and then recently the Etowah County Detention Center, the contract is going to be ending, and it's really one of the worst facilities in the country. So it's been a huge fight for many years, was open for 24 years, I think. And then on defund, we actually, for the first time, are seeing Biden push for less detention beds in his budget, 9,000 less detention beds than was put forth last year. So I think this is it's a sign like this. I mean, to some degree, again, this is, the perspective is like, if you shut down a detention center in one place, it'll go somewhere else. But part of the reason why we do this work is to show like why we shouldn't have detention. And we actually have a lot more power in certain places. And what we've seen now is that the administration is actually addressing some detention in the South. So the idea was always like, if you close these detention centers in New Jersey or in California, you're just going to have them go elsewhere. But actually, this is about a national movement. It's about all of us. And yes, sometimes it feels like a game of whack-a-mole, but the truth is, like, when you have a national movement, impacts happen in different parts of the country. And I think that sort of combination of calling for closure and not a quote unquote alternative, and I'll get to that in a second, and defund, like shrink the system, take some money away, is how we're seeing these like wins. Like we have turned the tide on immigration detention, and that's largely because we called for the abolition and we said, you don't need this. So I think that's really key, and that's why, and because it's been a combination of like a convergence. So it's organizers, it's people detained who have been fighting for their lives, it's lawyers who've been working with people detained, it's litigators who have been fighting on these specific detention centers and specific laws, it's journalists who've been exposing what's happening, it's advocates in DC who have been pushing so it's not like these things don't happen in a vacuum, but understanding that the base building and organizing is a key piece of this to like move the action. It's also where you can make the boldest demands. It's harder for journalists, can't do that, advocates can't do that, like, or advocates, they can to some degree. But I think the, lawyers, it's a mixed bag. Their access, other things are there, but you need to have that organizing base to really push those bold demands. And that's how we got here. We made the case that actually detention in its present form is not something that should be expanded. It's the first time we've been able to do that in 40 years, right? So like, that's because of movement. That's what's happening now. And so I guess I'll just say, like, in this context of lawyers in that work, I think it's so important to understand the sort of abolitionist steps versus the reformist reforms. The reformist reforms are things that entrench the system. So I think for many years, advocates and other people have said, well, electronic monitors are better, or GPS monitoring or other things are better. And now that's expanding. And so there's this idea, there's some correlation, but actually, like, what we should be saying is that a non-carceral approach is what's important for immigration. We can't keep enforcing these sort of ideas. And then the other sort of framework that lawyers are offering now is that, well, like, if people have lawyers, then they're going to benefit, and that can be an alternative to detention. It's like, not really. The law is bad. Like, most people who are seeking asylum are not going to get relief because of the law. Most people are prevented from even getting a lawyer because they're subject to expedited removal, and things are happening so fast. Like, most people aren't going to have that. So we actually still, again, going to sort of what I was saying earlier, have to push against these policies, have to push against the money that's going to the system. That's where we're going to have the greater impacts, while we do those sort of like urgent reforms support that can happen with people who are currently detained, and like get as much relief as we can in the sort of limits that exist.
Thank you, Silky. I also wanted to maybe ask Laila to answer this next question. you also sort of wrestled with this like tension of the role of lawyers in creative organizing, particularly at the heart of the carceral abolition in your upcoming article. Can you explain the framework you developed for lawyers seeking to practice a deportation abolition ethic?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll just start by saying I was reading a lot and, reading about carceral abolition theory and trying to understand, as many people have argued that and kind of made clear, that the immigration policing system is just part of this larger carceral system. So, immigration enforcement, policing, surveillance, detention, deportation, that's part of this larger carceral system, and a way that the state is exerting violence and control over communities of color. So I kind of was reading this. I was also reading about the work of folks who are in this Zoom room, like reading about Detention Watch and projects, South, NIP, NLG's, work, and lots of other folks, and who were often explicitly abolitionist in kind of the way that they've described themselves, and some who maybe that's not on the website, but it's like very clear that there's an analysis of systems as having long built these racial hierarchies, and there's a need to kind of dismantle this racism, delegitimize kind of the immigration policing, to shrink the state, to ensure that there's smaller budgets, not larger ones, as Silky was saying, to fund body cameras, or to fund alternatives to detention, ankle monitors, and things like that. And so as I was kind of reading, I kind of created this framework of thinking about how lawyers who may not identify as movement lawyers, I mean, just thinking about like folks in direct legal services organizations, all sorts of different spaces, how they could practice a deportation abolition ethic. And so I suggested kind of like 3 themes. One is to think of, how to have an anti-racist orientation. So understanding that we have to dismantle this. So guiding questions that folks should ask themselves are, how have we educated ourselves about the history of immigration policing and its racist history? What about our organizational vision, the implementation of our work? Is it anti-racist? How are we centering? How are we making sure that it's being led by those who are most directly impacted, those who have been kind of most harmed by the system? What about our case selection? If you go on the immigration courts, like EOIR, like Free Legal Services website, you'll see like lots of folks say, we will not represent detained people. We will not represent people who have criminal histories. It's out there. And then also very informally, I've long known organizations that are like, yeah, we work with young people, but we're not going to take cases over 16, And so, thinking about the ways that you're kind of through your strategy, through your case selection, how are you ensuring that you're disrupting the system, instead of kind of like bolstering this idea and narrative of like what a good immigrant is and like who's deserving of protection. And then, of course, same questions in policy advocacy. Number 2, thinking about, again, this like power and privilege and how to ensure that you're like supporting power building in communities, you're disrupting the kind of power and violence being exerted by the state and corporations, the private prison companies that are working in concert. And there's lots of lawyering decisions where you can think about this. It could be like how you approach working with your client. I worked for many years just with young people, and how to make sure that it's clear like who's the boss of who's the client, who's directing it, versus who's the person who's providing the information, so that people understand like the legal system and the choices that they're really making, that they can make informed choices. And so lots of questions about narrative too in courtrooms and the resources and how there are bad laws, but like how can you kind of push forward with folks goals without kind of like adding more legitimacy to these systems and narratives, and then ultimately folks have to think about structural change, how to reimagine the system. And I think the kind of tool that Silky talked about is really helpful in thinking about like, is this initiative that I'm arguing for, is it gonna ensure that there's like more investment in the state? Like, are we putting more money towards the system, or are we like shrinking the deportation machine? Because the goal is not, as one colleague said, due process rich deportations, right? That's not the goal. The goal is to restrict the deportation machine. And so I think really being intentional about understanding that is important as well.
Thank you so much, Laila. So I wanted to invite Chioma to answer this next question, which we're kind of talking about the challenges, challenging the limits of the law, and providing direct services or litigation is critical work, but often operates within the legal paradigm that attempts to exceptionalize stories in extractive ways. How do we engage in storytelling and movement lawyering without sensationalizing trauma? Similarly, like how do we navigate fighting for immediate relief? For like, as we have discussed before, like humane conditions in detention centers or abolishing them in general, without sort of legitimizing the system as it exists. And I know that you've worked and talked a little bit about earlier in the conversation about raising Black voices, especially Black immigrant voices. So I feel like maybe you could speak a little bit more to that and within this sort of theme of like challenging the limits of the law.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the first point about the balance between not sensationalizing trauma, but also raising voices, it all starts again with mission. What's the purpose? What's the purpose or mission behind the messaging or the speech? I guess the simplest example that I can give in my career. Early in my career, I had the opportunity to testify before city council. At that time, this is Philadelphia City Council, where I'm based. The city was reconsidering an agreement, whether they should continue to share information with ICE. And of course, we were advocating against that. And some of the examples I gave came directly from clients, people who I'd worked with, situations with ICE, situations where ICE overstepped bounds, broke the rules. And I felt it was important to share these sometimes really difficult stories so that people could hear and have real life experience and real life examples of what people go through. Not just me as an attorney speaking about it in an academic sense or in a just legal sense, but this actually impacts people's real lives. So I think again, the mission, the purpose. What is the purpose of sharing this information? If it's to highlight someone's story, if it's to point to a policy that you want to change, or you want to uplift, it's necessary because it gives context, it makes it real, it makes it important. So I think it's critical again when you're doing mission-based work. You will use a lot of different tools to accomplish that mission. And then the question about the balance between not legitimizing the system but also working within it. It's something that attorneys like myself who work in this space, we struggle with it every day. We all know that the law changes very slow. notwithstanding the huge accomplishments that came out of the uprisings in 2020, we have the Breonna Taylors of the world. We have the names of people that we don't even know. We have many, many other people who have been, who have not received justice. And we know that it will still take many, many more years of advocacy, of protesting, of lawsuits, of going to court before you see the justice and the change in the system that you really want to see. So what do you do in the meantime? Because all of it is important. Advocacy is important, but representing clients is very important. People need help. People need lawyers. You have a lot of folks who are in, whether they like it or not, whether we like it or not, people are in the system. They need lawyers. They need people who can actually explain to them what's happening to them. They need people who can stand next to them. And so you have to work with what you have simultaneously to advocating to change what it is currently, knowing that it's not going to happen overnight, knowing that there's still millions of people who are impacted and need the services of advocates and attorneys. So for me, and again, I will admit I'm biased, being an attorney and seeing so many people who have come to me late, maybe people who we could have helped, but if they had gotten to us sooner, the stark need to have people who are educated, who are prepared, who are mission oriented to work with people within the system while we're also trying to change it.
Thank you, Chioma, for that. And I think it helps to transition to our sort of final question, and really trying to contextualize the sort of all of the information that you've given us. A lot of students are on this call and thinking about, they're excited about organizing and thinking about how they can change the laws, advance justice. So maybe we can help to sort of give practical advice on how to build like movements of movements, and what this kind of, how do you envision building this kind of thing, and what it would require, what kinds of roles are needed, and where do lawyers fit in that, and also where do non-lawyers fit in that as well, since Silky's on this call as well. So that would be really good to end on this note, perhaps. In the last final minutes, I know we only have a bit, about six or so minutes. So I know there's a lot to cover, but I'd appreciate if we could be concise just for the attendees that only have an hour.
I'll just be really quick and just say, like, don't just do the thing, like build relationships outside of like the community that you lawyer with, like outside of like the law school, outside of like once you get a job, like whatever you do, just like build relationships with people who are organizing in your community, build with them and like work with them and sort of discover like the role that you can play. The role that you can play will evolve, it'll change, it'll depend on the certain conditions, but it's so much about the relationships and ensuring that if you work in a vacuum and you're just, the only thing you do is interact with other lawyers, whether as like a legal service provider, an academic, a litigator, et cetera, you're gonna stay within the confines of how you think about that. And you really need to make sure that if you're gonna be, like I said, lawyering doesn't happen without movement. So if you're gonna engage in movement, like actually do that very concertedly and make sure that that's a part of your work. It's not just like, maybe you're doing some organizing outside of it, et cetera. So I think that's the big push that I would make.
Yeah, thank you, Silky. I would also encourage folks to think about kind of broadening our demands. Like, for example, abolition. I don't think it should stay only to the confines of domestic sort of structures of infrastructures of oppression, like policing and prisons. It should also extend to U.S. imperialism and dismantling white supremacy throughout the system. It's not okay for the same as it's not okay for like police in the US to target people of color. It's also not okay for the US military to go out there and kill Black and brown people, somewhere in the global South. So we really need to see the connections, understand the role of white supremacy in these various structures, and work in an intersectional manner. And I would, encourage folks to check out organizations outside of the US that also engage in movement lawyering, like the National Union of People's Lawyers in the Philippines. They're just, just such inspirational work using various strategies to really fight for and alongside the movement, while they themselves are really putting their lives, on the line in the course of doing this work.
I'm going to invite any of the rest of the panelists if they have anything else to add, perhaps, to this. Otherwise, I could wrap things up. I guess I will then. Yeah, I wanted to thank you for providing, a really good discussion on this topic, and also helping to finally also contextualize this topic for individuals who want to join in, especially our students. And I wanted to thank obviously all of the panelists for joining and for having these conversations with us without pay, and especially amid a pandemic. I want to thank everyone for joining and remind them of our final discussion on abolitionist futures on April 13th. And also to fill out an anonymous form and share your feedback on and thoughts on what you would like to see next from Immigration End series. Prashasti will share these links down below, hopefully. Yeah, thank you so much for joining our conversation, and hope to see you on our final discussion, and also in the future of Immigration End, and it's hopefully its future next semester or in the upcoming fall. Thank you all.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.